trope is not a bad word on this channel. I think a lot of writers hear trope and they think cliche, something that readers have encountered over and over again to the point that it makes a story predictable or boring or reductive. And honestly, that couldn't be further from the truth. What a trope is it is a common story pattern that allows your readers to contextualize the story. It also allows you as the author to exploit reader expectations, either in order to fulfill them while also getting to do other things in your story. Imagine doing something no one's ever done before. You'd have to spend so much focus of the story just on that one thing and getting the reader's expectations set up accordingly that you could do nothing else in your story. Tropes allow you to shortcut that and have a more nuanced and exciting story because the expectations are already set. Or it allows you to subvert those expectations, or at least threaten to subvert those expectations, which makes the reading more interesting. I'm a big believer in the fact that any trope can be done well. Some tropes more easily than others. So I'm going to take you through 18 popular romance tropes and how you can do them well in your story. I'll also give you some examples from my own reading where I have them. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Sam. I'm a romance author based in the UK, and I use these tropes. I approach a story knowing what tropes I'm leveraging so that, again, I can either fulfill or subvert expectations and create a touchstone with my readers. It is also a marketing tool, especially for some of the bigger tropes like enemies to lovers, friends to lovers. And if you search any of these tropes online, especially on something like Goodreads, you're gonna find lists of books that fall within this trope. If you're more interested in my own writing process, you can hit subscribe. I've got writing vlogs coming out all the time talking about the work that I have going on at the moment. But for now, let's get straight into the list of tropes. Number one, I think it's probably the most popular, most referenced trope on social media, at least, that I see, and that is enemies to lovers. It's really interesting because you see a lot of books marketed as enemies to lovers that are really more of a rivals to lovers, and that's especially true in contemporary fiction, romance, for example, because it's very rare that like a normal person would have an enemy. To do this trope well, we need to believe both ends of the story. We need to believe them as enemies. We need to fully be on board with why they are enemies. And by the end of the story, we need to be begging for them to be lovers. I've read some enemies to lovers where it's like, I don't really believe why they were rivals to begin with. They just had a bad first impression, and that's not really rivals, is it? It just was like an awkward first encounter and they're being jerks and holding grudges about it. Like, that just doesn't work for me. And I think for most readers, that would fall a little bit flat. So there needs to be a genuine reason why they're rivals or enemies at the beginning. And likewise, it needs to be something that can be overcome through your character arcs so that we can believe them coming together at the end, and so they feel like they've come closer through that experience of growing past whatever was keeping them apart to begin with. There's a lot of contemporary rivals to lovers that you might be expecting me to reference. I think maybe the most popular one is The Love Hypothesis, but if you're not new to my channel, then you know that I hate that book, so we're not recommending that one. Actually, one of my favorite rivals to lovers is Beach Read by Emily Henry. They're really only rivals right at the beginning. They do become friends. It's sort of like a rivals to friends to lovers story, but they were university rivals and now they've sort of come back together as adults. So that kind of makes more sense as a rival situation. We can understand why they were rivals. We can also understand now that they're older and now that they are spending more time together, we'll get to forced proximity in a minute, why they're able to grow past that. So if you haven't read Beach Read by Emily Henry, I think it's a really good way of doing the rivals to lovers thing. In terms of a proper enemies to lovers, I'm not a huge fantasy reader. So if you've got recommendations for your favorite enemies to lovers fantasy or proper enemies to lovers, people hating each other, drop them in the comments. The twin sister of rivals to lovers is friends to lovers. I love this idea that like people do change over time and sometimes those changes lead to developing feelings. Similar to rivals to lovers, the key to getting this one right is us believing why they weren't together to begin with. They need to have really good reasons for not having been together from the very beginning. And likewise, we also need to believe the chemistry, and we need to believe the love that exists by the end. The chemistry is a really big one. Like, have they always had this chemistry and they're just idiots and super blind to it? Or have they had the chemistry but they've been in other relationships and so they couldn't act on it? Or has this chemistry somehow developed over time based on character changes that have happened? That last one is my favorite one to read, but I think it's also the hardest one to get right. Another thing that I think is really poorly done about this trope is the whole idea, and I spoke about this in my last reading wrap up because I read a couple of stories last month that were like this, where people are like, oh, but he doesn't like me that way, like well into the story. And you need to have some like level of self-awareness in your characters. They need to not be completely blind to what's going on. There need to be believable reasons why they're ignoring signs, or they need to be processing those signs in the interiority of your novel. For this reason, Love and Other Words, which is technically friends to lovers romance, actually kind of fails on this for me because I don't believe them at the beginning. I don't understand or believe why they're not together from the first time that they meet. Some that I think do this really well are People We Meet on Vacation by Emily Henry, and also One True Loves by Taylor Jenkins Reid. One of the guys in that one is her like high school friend. Trope number 3, one of my least favorite tropes, and that is the pregnancy trope. You see this a lot in like really spicy contemporary romance, and sometimes it's done as a way of like forcing the romantic lead and the romantic hero to like admit their feelings for each other. Sometimes it's forcing a one-night stand to turn into something more. I personally don't like this trope at all when the pregnancy happens during the story. I think that in so many situations, the concept of choice is just not even touched. If you've got recommendations for stories that do that well, again, leave those in the comments so that other people can see it. I personally don't love this trope as I've read it so far. I do love a marriage and babies epilogue, and so I have read a few books that do that really well, but I'm obviously not going to give any spoilers to any books by telling you any examples of that. So for me, the key to doing the pregnancy trope well is to make it an afterthought at the end to just kind of show the future of the characters, but at least just make sure that you're being realistic about the way your characters would think and behave. Becoming pregnant doesn't instantly turn on a love switch in their brain, and I think that that's what I so often see, and it just isn't realistic. Trope number 4, marriage of convenience. Again, this is one that tends to look quite different in something like a fantasy romance versus a contemporary romance. Because in a fantasy romance, you might have a political marriage of convenience, or trying to stop a war, or like, I'm pretty sure, isn't ACOTAR a marriage of convenience? I've not read it, so I have no idea, but you do get a lot more of that kind of thing. There are contemporary romances that are marriage of convenience, however. I read one last month that was called The Co-op by Tara DeWitt. And my comment in that one, which is kind of my piece of advice, is that I didn't believe why they had to get married. In that instance, it was because they were both left this house in their grandmother's will because their grandmothers were together. And it's like, I don't fully believe that getting married was the best way to deal with this, especially when it's layered with the rivals to lovers element. So I think it's kind of a weird choice to do like marriage of convenience. I do think sometimes it can be done well. I've not actually read any books where it's been done really well, but an example of one that's on my shelf is Would You Rather by Allison Ashley. The premise of that is that it's a marriage of convenience for health insurance purposes. That makes a lot more sense to me. Visa marriages, things like that, those make more sense to me as marriage of convenience, and I think that they'll make more sense to readers as well. So make sure it's believable that the actual marriage part is convenient. Otherwise, we're gonna spend the whole story questioning your characters' motivations, questioning their common sense, and that's not what you're hoping to do, I imagine. Trope number 5, second chance romance. So this is when people were together when they were younger, and then they get together again later on. I've recently read Happy Place by Emily Henry. This is a great example of this. The really important thing here is we need to have a really believable reason why they broke up to begin with, but we also need to really be on board with the idea that they've overcome it. So this is kind of similar to the enemies to lovers bit. Like, why did they break up? And how are we meant to believe that they are over that now? Again, I think Happy Place did that really well. I also think Love and Other Words did a good job of that. Number 6, Childhood Sweethearts. This is very similar to Happy Place, except sometimes there's more of a focus on the fact that they were kids. And so a lot of times the reason they split up is less dramatic and it's more just that they grew apart. I've not read a lot of these. I wouldn't actually put Love and Other Words in that category because I think they were in college when they broke up the first time. So if you've got any good childhood sweethearts ones, let me know in the comments. But the key to doing childhood sweethearts well is having a really clear through line between who they were as kids and who they are as adults. And what does that mean for your characters? I think that this is best done when there's something else at stake. Maybe they reunite when one of them is in a different relationship, and so they're reflecting on what it would mean for them to return to that fundamental part of themselves that this other person brings out versus the future that they've been working on. That brings us really well into number 7, which is love triangles. Now, technically, a true love triangle is person A is in love with person B, who's in love with person C, who's in love with person A. I don't know that I've ever read a book that's a true love triangle. Usually when we're talking about a love triangle, we're talking about two people who are in love with the same person. Usually that person is our main character, but sometimes our main character is one of the two people involved in that love triangle. A really classic example of this is like the Hunger Games. Gale and Peeta both are in love with Katniss. The key to doing this trope well is not just the main character choosing between two hot people that like them, but rather choosing between two different versions of themselves and different versions of the future that they want. So in that instance, Hunger Games is a good example because the future that she wants with Gale is one of activism and fighting back against the establishment and fighting to make sure that what they're trying to overthrow doesn't get replicated, that kind of thing. And the future with Peeta is one of peace and rest and acceptance and building a home together. And those are two different warring parts of her as well. So it does a good job there. Where Hunger Games I don't think does a great job is both of the options need to be very well fleshed out and likable options. As the reader, I shouldn't look at that and know exactly what the main character is going to choose. When I was reading the Hunger Games, I knew the whole time what she was going to choose. It was very obvious. Same with Twilight. You know the whole time what she's gonna choose. One book that I think does this incredibly well, which I mentioned earlier, is One True Loves by Taylor Jenkins Reid, where our main character was married and then her husband went missing and was presumed dead. She moved on. She got engaged to another man, her friend from high school, and then her husband comes back and she has to decide what she wants to do. That was so well done because until the very end, I wasn't certain what she was going to do. I knew what I wanted her to do, but I wasn't certain what she was going to do, and I wouldn't have been mad with TJR if she had gone in the direction other than the one that I wanted, because it would have made sense to the character. Both options made equal sense to the character. Number 8, we have Grumpy Sunshine. I love Grumpy Sunshine romances. This essentially means that one of your characters is a grumpy character, one of your characters is a really happy character, and the two of them fall in love, and their differing dispositions bring out all sorts of hilarious situations and sometimes conflict and things like that. The most important thing about getting Grumpy Sunshine right is that both characters feel nuanced. A character cannot be all grump, nor can they be all sunshine. That is unrealistic. My favorite example of this done well is Beach Read by Emily Henry, which I know I've already used as an example. Some of these are going to repeat because most books leverage multiple tropes. In Beach Read, while January is not the sunshiniest main character, Gus is definitely meant to be the grump, but he's still a fully formed character. And I think one of the things that makes that work really well in that book is that they're in a place where he's got extended family, so you get to see different sides of him. Another one that I really liked was All Roads Lead Here by Mariana Zapata. Tobias Rhodes is like Jim Hopper from Stranger Things. He is wonderful. And similarly, the main character in that book is not all sunshine. That brings us to number 9, which is the single parent trope. I'm a sucker for a single dad trope. All roads lead here. And that is an example of one that does it really well. What I hate in books is when someone is a single parent and then the kid plays like zero role in the story. I don't know about you, but every single parent that I know, their kid is a huge part of their life. They are the most important part of their life. Even if they're not the one that has primary custody, their kid is still a huge part of their life. And so the fact that a whole novel's worth of plot would go by and the kid would not come up at all, or they would come up, but more as like a conversation point or a way to generate conflict, that's so unrealistic, and I think it can really pull a reader out of the story. That said, kids are hard to write. They're very different than writing other side characters, other family. So books that I think have done that really well are, again, All Roads Lead Here, but also The Soulmate Equation by Christina Lauren. Excellent, excellent job. That's a single mother in that one, and her kid is very present in that story. In Soulmate Equation, I think her kid's like 7 or 8, maybe, and in All Roads Lead Here, the son is a bit older. I think he's like 13, 14, something like that. I haven't read much good single parent romance where the kid was much younger than that. Editing Sam here. What I was getting ready to say is that I don't read a lot of single parent romance where the kid is significantly younger, and that's mostly because I think that when a kid is that young, it's really hard to be able to focus on anything but the kid. They tend to be more like hands-on at that age, and so it's really when you get to that like 6, 7, 8 and older that it seems like it's more possible to build a romance plot around there being a child involved. But also I wanted to pop in because since filming this video, I have read another really good single parent romance, which is Funny Feelings by Tara DeWitt. And this is a really, really good one that's kind of like friends to lovers and also single parent. So a very different one to All Roads Lead Here or The Soulmate Equation. So another good one for you to reference there. Back to the video. Number 10. Forced proximity. I told you it was coming. This is where characters are forced to spend a significant amount of time with each other for whatever reason. The strict definition is that they're like physically quite isolated together, but this can be stretched to mean that they just have to spend a lot of time together. The most important thing to doing forced proximity well is that it's believable why they are spending that time together. It's such a good way of like amping up the chemistry, amping up the tension, but especially in a contemporary setting or whatever, the one bed trope, like if I genuinely don't like someone, again, this gets especially true when we're trying to layer rivals to lovers. If I don't like someone or I've got someone that I'm strictly trying to keep in the friend zone or whatever's happening there, there is no way I'm sharing a bed with them. I will lie awake all night on the floor. There are probably no shenanigans going on. So just make sure that it's realistic. Again, I feel like this is a lot easier in like a fantasy situation, but in contemporary, forced proximity must be believable. Number 11, Insta-love. I really struggle with this trope. I don't love it. Certainly don't Insta-love it. Insta-love basically means that like from the moment these people lay eyes oh my God, why can't I say that? From the moment these people lay eyes on each other, they are hooked. They are in love. They are convinced that this is their destiny. This is their fate. And I hate this because I, as a reader, don't believe in love at first sight. I believe in lust at first sight. And I believe that you can fall very quickly for someone, but certainly not when you first see them, and probably not in the first interaction that you have with them. I don't think that that's possible, and a lot of readers don't think that that's possible. So in order to do this well, you need to do 2 things. First of all, it needs to be clear that that spark is lust, not true love. It's totally fine if there's just some magnetic energy going on. Totally great. Make sure that you develop that initial chemistry into something more substantial throughout the story, that they're not just riding that high throughout, and that whatever conflict they're going through is bringing up deep-seated stuff that's helping them fall properly in love with each other, not just that initial attraction. Second of all, you need to be self-aware as hell in this book, especially if you're going for like the soulmates fate kind of element. If you're going to insist that something is fate, unless you've got a really specific like fantasy premise or religion or structure that you're working from, make sure that you are super self-aware, either in the interiority, like this feels like fate, he feels like my soulmate, and that's crazy because I don't even think I believe in that, but it also feels true. something like that, or at least have side characters that are there trying to be the voice of reason, and make sure your main character isn't like completely shutting them out. A book that I read that did this really poorly recently was Love Your Life by Sophie Kinsella, where her friends were like trying to tell her he's not your soulmate.
He is not the love of your life. He is literally just a guy. Hit him with your car.
And she's just like, oh my god, no, you guys are crazy. The most annoying heroine ever. So don't do that. Make sure that it grows from lust into something more substantial and that you add some self-awareness into the story. One book which is not strictly a romance, but is a fantasy with a romance thread that I think does this quite well is Daughter of Smoke and Bone. There's actually a really good reason for like the Insta-love, but I don't want to spoil it. It's very complex, but if you're looking for something that does like Insta-love and like soulmate kind of vibes quite well, that's a good one. Number 12, Forbidden Love. Kind of falls into the category of like enemies to lovers versus rivals to lovers, of who really has enemies these days, and similarly, who is actually forbidden to anyone these days. Like, it could be your grandma pissed my grandma off. Could be something really stupid keeping them apart, but a lot of times in books that's enough for it to be like forbidden. I just don't really buy that. I think that when we're talking about forbidden, too often we fall into this like duty keeping them apart, and I think especially in a contemporary setting that just doesn't make any sense. I think that if your character is in an environment or a family or whatever where anyone would be like actually forbidden, that's a pretty toxic environment and that needs to be addressed within the story. And otherwise, probably no one is actually forbidden, and so it's probably better to lean into the real reasons why they don't want to be together, which probably means you're more in the realm of rivals to lovers. That said, my favorite forbidden love is Red, White, and Royal Blue by Casey McQuiston, and this is a love story between the fictionalized first son of the United States and Prince of England. Number 13, fake dating. This is kind of like marriage of convenience, but less commitment, I guess. My problem with fake dating when I see it is that it so often tends to just be to make someone jealous, or in the case of the love hypothesis, to get my friends off my back. That's another popular one, get my family off my back about not having someone. And I definitely buy into that a lot more easily than the marriage of convenience. But I think that so often fake dating is meant to sort of be bringing together the marriage of convenience with like forced proximity and either a rivals to lovers or friends to lovers situation, and it makes it really difficult because those situations can end up being really unbelievable. So something that starts as really well-meaning, again, using love hypothesis as an example, her just like kissing a random person to try to convince her friend that she's dating someone, still feels over the top, but like we can get on board with that. Continuing the charade and going into all of these ridiculous situations just to try to prove that you're dating, like sitting on their lap during a lecture? Nah. It's just not believable. And what you have to do to make this work is really ask, why would they continue with this charade to the extent that they do? Number 14, we have fish out of water. Now, what this typically means is that someone is in a place that is super foreign to them. An often cited example of this is It Happened One Summer by Tessa Bailey. I did not like that book, but it is a good example of fish out of water because you have your main character who is this like minor celebrity influencer, and she goes to this remote fishing village where no one's ever heard of her other than the fact that I think her dad used to live there, if I remember correctly. And everyone lives very differently than her. She's having to do a lot of things that are different than she normally would do. A lot of books do fish out of water really well. I think the ones that do the best have a different kind of motivation for the fish out of water situation. Something like It Happened One Summer, it's born simply of circumstance. It's like a punishment for the main character, and they're only staying there because of that. And the big question is like, will I stay or will I go? Should I stay or should I go? And to be fair, my first book is a little bit like that, but there need to be deeper reasons why the person is there. So in the example of my first book, yes, she goes out of circumstantial necessity, but she's also going because it's where her family is from and she is estranged from them. She wants to know more. And that's Maybe not her initial reason for going there, but that's definitely why she stays. It's not circumstance that's keeping her there. So make sure that there's a deep character reason for it, otherwise your conflict is likely to feel really shallow. The fish out of water and like whether that will become permanent shouldn't be the only conflict and the only motivation happening in your book. A couple of books that do this really well, Part of Your World by Abby Jimenez. This is about a big city doctor who's spending lots of time with a small town carpenter slash hotel owner. As well, something a little bit different is a fantasy I read last month called The Girl Who Fell Beneath the Sea by Axia O. And this is a YA fantasy with a romance thread. And it's about a girl who finds herself in the spirit realm because she's sacrificed herself to the sea god in place of someone else. And so there's a really good reason why she's there. And there's something else for her to do while she's there other than just trying to figure out how to leave. This trope does work really well when you put a clock on it though. In that book, there is a 1 month clock, whereas in something like Part of Your World, it's a little bit more indefinite. Number 15, we have workplace romance. Now listen, if you speak to anyone who has dated someone at work, it is not as simple as like, oh, but he's my boss, or oh, but we would have to see each other if something happened. It is far more political and complicated than that. It's like, oh, he signs off all of my expenses. Oh, he approves all the hiring for my team. Like, these are all reasons why it is hella complicated to date someone from work, and that if you do date someone from work, keeping it secret is sometimes easier, but also potentially opens you up to a lot of issues in the future. If someone finds out, people are gonna be a lot more hesitant to date colleagues than they have been in the past because people better understand the political complexity and the risk that that creates. So make sure again that it's believable and that all of that is considered in a very self-aware way within the narrative. I personally have not read any workplace romances that I think were done well. A couple that I have heard of, one, the one that you're probably thinking of and shouting at the screen right now, is The Hating Game. I have not read that. Another workplace romance that I've heard of that I think is recent or is coming out soon is The Love Wager by Lynn Painter. Don't know anything about it, don't know even remotely if it fits the bill, but I might pick it up just to see. If you've got recommendations for workplace romances that do everything I just talked about really well, drop it in the comments. Number 16, going in a slightly different direction, is Secret Billionaire. This is a whole genre. Google it if you don't believe me. And the whole premise of it is, oh, I met this guy. Maybe I met him online or I met him in a bar or whatever. And it turns out he's like a billionaire or an heir or a prince or something like that. Very Cinderella story. The problem with a lot of these, especially the like spicy contemporary romance that I see with like the shirtless guys on the covers, that seems to be the whole point of it, right? It's almost like wish fulfillment for the main character. Like they just can't believe their luck that this has happened. I have never read something that I think does this well, but what I think would make this be done well is if rather than it being this like wish fulfillment scenario, if actually the secret wealth brought out a lot of contrasting points between the characters, if it actually created conflict from the very beginning rather than creating this like dream scenario. Again, if you've got examples, drop them below. Number 17, mistaken identity. Now this could mean a few things. This could mean, oh, I thought I was talking to you, but I was actually talking to your twin. Or, oh, you looked like someone I knew and I accidentally started talking to the wrong person, but I very quickly realized it and then fell in love with the person that I found. It could be, I sat down at the wrong table on a blind date and didn't even realize I was on a date with the wrong person. There's so many different ways that this could be interpreted. And I think that means that it actually is something that's quite easy to do well. I think where it's harder is where there's a duplicitousness to it. So where someone is being deceptive. I don't have any book examples for this one, but a film example that I really liked was Love Hard, starring Nina Dobrev. I think it was a Netflix film. It's like a Christmas movie where she thinks that she's talking to this one guy online that she's met, and it turns out it's his like high school best friend. And she's gone to his hometown to meet him, and she finds out it's the wrong guy. The wrong guy starts trying to set her up with the right guy, and because it's a romance, I don't feel bad saying this, but she ends up, of course, falling for who was originally the wrong guy. If you're gonna do something like this, it's really important that we understand why the person is going along with the duplicitousness to begin with, why the deception is worthwhile to them, because that's a huge risk. I think in Love Hard, it's quite low risk for the guy at the beginning because he's just doing it online and he's talking to someone who's hundreds of miles away. So it doesn't really matter. In some mistaken identity stories, they continue to go along with the lie for a long time. Why is that? We need to believe why that is. And you also need to make sure that the redemption that comes as a result of that deception is meaningful. So it can't just be like, oh, you were lying to me the whole time, but that's fine. Like, no one's gonna be on board with that. So make sure that there are genuine steps towards redemption there. And finally, at number 18, we have miscommunication. This is one that can be interpreted a few different ways. A lot of times it's just someone misunderstands something that happens, or they see something happening and they misunderstand what's going on. That can be quite a frustrating situation to deal with because you can get a good way through the story and think, if you just had a single conversation, you said exactly this, you said exactly this, there's no reason why you can't say those things to each other. This whole story wouldn't happen. If you're gonna do miscommunication trope well, what you need to do is make sure that it's really clear why that conversation can't happen. What is the baggage or the obstacle that's getting in the way for each character? Both characters need to have reasons why that conversation's not happening. Otherwise, your reader's just gonna be frustrated the whole time. A book that I think does the miscommunication trope quite well is my second book, The Summer Wedding in Santorini. If you haven't read the first one, that's fine. The second one sort of reads as a standalone because it came out a few years after the first one. It is miscommunication trope to an extent, but it also is a very well-founded miscommunication and rather lack of communication because you understand the baggage and the reasons why this conversation can't happen. And I'm not just saying that, it's been said by people who have read it, it's said in the reviews, it was said at my mother's book club that I spoke at. So I think that's a good example if I do say so myself. I hope that you can see that any trope, whether it's secret billionaire, friends to lovers, or miscommunication, regardless of what the trope is, you can do it well. If you're not already, be sure to hit subscribe so that you can see more videos like this one and my writing vlogs as they come out, so you can see me put some of these tropes into action in my latest project. And of course, let me know your recommendations for books with these tropes in the comments. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.